This shir is in memory of Sarah Lamdrach, Sarah Rivka Bat Harav Nachum Umindel. Today we'll be talking about Tehillim, Perek Kuf Chav Zayin, Psalm 127. In this Perek of Tehillim, David discusses something very, very basic to the human identity, to human psychology, and that is about man's needs, what a person needs most in this world. The Tehillim starts out as follows: Shir Hamalot Lishlomo, a song of ascents to Solomon. Im Hashem lo yivna bayit, shav amlu bonim bo. Im Hashem lo yishmor ir, shav shakad shomer. If Hashem will not build the house, then workers may toil in vain, but it will not be built. If God will not watch the city, the watchman can stay awake all night, but he stays awake in vain, for the city will not be watched. Shav lachem mashkimeku me'acharei shevet, ochlai lechem ha'atzavim, ken yitain li dido sheina. It's in vain for those people who rise early to be able to make money and be able to get their food, and they stay up late, and yet they eat the bread of toil. And on the other hand, God can give his beloved anything they need while they sleep. In the past two psukim, the author is discussing a person's basic needs. We have here the discussion of security, the discussion of safety, the discussion of shelter, that a person needs a house, a person needs a city to live in, and the city to be secure. And the author writes that if God does not want the city to be secure, if God does not want the house to be built, then it will not be built. The Da'at Mikra is very careful to mention that a person has to put in their own effort into the building of the house or into the watching of the ear. There are workers on the house. There is a watchman to the city. But ultimately, if God does not want that to happen, it will not happen. And conversely, if he does want the house to be built, if he does want a person to have shelter, if he does want the city to be secure, then it will be built. The second basic need that the psalmist described is that of prosperity, of food, of health. And what we see here is that it seems to be the psalmist is going through what we would call maybe Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The most basic needs first, the need for the physiological needs of just to have a shelter, of a place to sleep, of a place to be, and then a slightly higher level need, that of safety, which is prosperity, which is the ability to have employment of resources. And the psalmist attributes all these very, very basic needs to God, whereas a person has to put in his effort. Ultimately, it's God's decision what the person will achieve. The second half of the Mizmor discusses something slightly different. Pasuk Gimel. Hine nachlat Hashem banim schar pri habeten. Children are the heritage of God. They are the fruit of the womb, that is a reward. Kechitzim biyad gibor kein b'nei haneurim. Like arrows in the hands of a strong person, so too are the children of one's youth. Ashrei hagever asher milei et ashpato mehem lo yevoshu. Happy is the person who has his quiver full of these types of arrows, full of children. They shall not be put to shame when they speak with their enemies at the gate, meaning when they fight their battles, they will prevail. And the children will bring glory to their father as they fight his battles. It's a very interesting juxtaposition between these two halves of the Mizmor. The first half seems to be talking about these basic needs that a man has, and then the second half, it seems to be discussing children. Perhaps we would say that the children are the next stage of what a person's basic needs are. In Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the next stage up is love and family. We're building relationships. Perhaps these children, instead of focusing on only the basic needs of life, he focuses then again on a higher level, on relationship, on children, on love. And perhaps the last section of the Mizmor when the children actually go out and fight the father's battles, perhaps we can attribute this to something of the self-actualization, the achievement, the accomplishment. And in this case, it is the children who are accomplishing something for the father. And the psalmist is saying this too is in God's hand. But we should realize, the psalmist realize that children are the real reward that a person has. Whereas a person can't live without safety, without food, without shelter, ultimately it's the children who bring him happiness. At this point, we would say that this mizmor is one that teaches emunah, the one that teaches one to rely on God and not to just attribute things that he has to the works of his own hands. Perhaps we can see, though, that there's a deeper layer when we look at the attribution of the mizmor at the superscription. The beginning of the mizmor is Shir Hamalo Li Shlomo, a song of ascents of Solomon. The Radak, the Ibn Ezra, Rashi, almost all the classical Mefarshim say that this is a mizmor written not by Shlomo, but for Shlomo, written by his father David. Now, once we have that insight, the mizmor takes on a whole different color. When the pasuk begins, Im Hashem lo yivne bayit, shav amlu bonim bo, it reminds us of a very important event in the life of David HaMelech, which is the bayit, the building of the Beit HaMikdash. And David perhaps is saying, I was not allowed to build the Beit HaMikdash. If God did not want the Beit HaMikdash to be built, shav amlu bo nafbo, I could have worked as hard as I wanted to. I would never have been able to build that house. And this is a message for his son Shlomo, who ultimately would be the one to build the Beit HaMikdash. David goes on, Im Hashem lo yishmor ir, shav shakad shomer. If God does not give security to a city, there's no one else can give that security. David did achieve security of the city. Which city? That of Yerushalayim. So David juxtaposes both his failure and his success and attributes both of them to God and teaches his son Shlomo that ultimately all of your achievements, even as king, you must attribute to God. And then he tells him, perhaps now we can have a different perspective on the second half of the Mizmor. When David says, Hinei nachlat Hashem banim, schar pri habeten, the portion of a person is, the portion of God is children, perhaps David is seeing his own dreams being fulfilled by his child, Shlomo, the one who will ultimately be the one to build that Beit HaMikdash that so eluded David. And then he gives us a very interesting perspective on the idea of a child fulfilling the dreams of his parent. And he says, Kechitzim biyad gibor, kein b'nei haneurim. This incredibly strong image of an archer shooting his arrow out and the arrow reaching the target. And the archer is a gibor, so the arrow is shot very hard. It's shot with great strength. And in a sense, the archer controls the arrow with that shot, even though the archer is no longer there when the arrow reaches the target. Perhaps we would say, though, that as strong as the archer is, and as much force as the archer puts into the arrow and guides the arrow, ultimately there might be things that might come up after the arrow leaves the bow that might change the course of the arrow. Perhaps a strong wind, perhaps a tree, a rock, a bird, anything might come up. In a sense, the arrow hitting the target is a combined effort, both of the archer and, we might say, of the arrow itself, of the environment that the arrow will go through. And David perhaps knows that his child, Shlomo, will hopefully build the Beit HaMikdash, but ultimately it will also be Shlomo's choice. He can guide Shlomo and give him a push and give him strength, but it'll be ultimately Shlomo himself who reaches the arrow. And David is gladdened by this, by the fact that his son will take over and perhaps build that bayit, and he teaches his son to attribute that bayit to God. And he says, Ashrei hagever asher mileh tashbato mehem lo yevoshu. Happy is the man who can fill his quiver with children like Shlomo, who can ultimately achieve that which eluded David. And perhaps when he says in Pasuk Bet, Shav lachem mashkimei kum me'acharei shevet, ochlei lechem ha'atzavim, Those of you who toil so hard to achieve something and do not achieve it, it is because God didn't want it to. So too he gives his beloved ones what they want in their sleep. And we know that Yedido, Yedidyah, is a name that God actually gave Solomon, not after he had achieved something, but actually right when he was born. So perhaps with this in mind, with this gloss in the sense of David talking about Solomon's achievement of something that David dreamed about for himself, we can see this deeper layer and understand that this Mizmor is not only about a person attributing their basic needs to God, but also about the interaction between parents and children, and also about the flow from David to Shlomo, and recognizing God in not only in our own lives, but in the way that we try to influence other people. Thank you so much, and again, this is for Zecher Nishmat Sarah Rivka Bat Harav Nachum Umindel.